Assalamu alaikum, ladies and gentlemen. Today we will continue from where we left off, and just to recapitulate what we were discussing at that point of time, let me recall we were more or less concentrating on perceptions, and the logic at that point that was given to you was that perceptions are more significant for marketers than the true reality. The reason was that perceptions are what creates an image of what the true reality is, and it's typically the same for products. Because when you look at a product, a feature can be presented to a consumer, but how he perceives that becomes more important for marketers. While doing that, we had also come into a discussion of the difference between product marketing and services marketing, and we had a lengthy explanation of why there becomes gaps which occur in the perceptions of people in terms of their satisfaction. And the gap, we remember, was between what is expected and what is perceived by the customer at the end of the interaction in the area of services. Now, again, recall that services marketing does tend to be a little more difficult because of four important features that services marketing has. Number one, it is inseparable from the delivery and the consumption. I mean, there can be no storing of that, and therefore it is also perishable. Second is very important, and that is it is variable, whereby we constantly suggest that it will change repeatedly because of the kind of environment at a point of time people may tire who are delivering the service, and all the other factors relate to, and that is why services marketing requires a lot of effort in trying to train people so that things can be standardized. However, the opposite side of the picture is that where you standardize, you lose the responsiveness to the customer. In other words, what is happening is that the immediate need that you can discern, the deliverer can discern from the customer may not be responded to as required because of the standardized procedures. So there is another concept which has been brought into position, and that is to allow empowerment to the deliverer so that he can also interact and be responsive to the customer. However, having discussed all these issues, I had suggested at the end that we will be discussing a little bit more on the concept of positioning and repositioning. Now, if you recall, when we were doing the perceptual mapping, it was very clearly laid down that perceptual mapping is a tool which helps the marketer to be able to find how does the customer perceive various products or services that are available in the market based on certain attributes. Now, at that point, it was also suggested to you that customers normally tend to look at various attributes by which they decide on the quality or how they perceive the image of the product. The marketers therefore need to be in the first instance, need to understand the priorities that are given by the customer to these various attributes, and then using combinations of these attributes, they create perceptual maps, which are also called positioning maps, whereby all the products that are available in a product category or in a product space are recorded or graphed on a map where you can see what are the positions that exist in the mind of the customer related to the various attributes. And I had given you an example of how then you can see that if there is a major gap of need based on the customer's ideal requirements, then you can position yourself in that area. Now, after all this we have done and position has taken place, that job of marketer does not stop at that point. What he has to do is to understand over a period of time how has the perception shifted between the products, because a new product comes into position, normally changes the various perceptions of the other products in relation. And therefore, positioning is always done and perception is always relative. Perception is relative against another competitive product, and that is what the marketing strategy conceptualization is that when you position yourself, you are actually positioning yourself in relation to your competitors. Now, having said that, we need to understand why, if we were correct in the original positioning and perception was also correct, what could have happened that requires new change? Why would we like to reposition the product? Now, sometimes it happens that the perceptions of the people change over a period of time, and that is why we regularly try and keep a track of the customer's perceptions, so that if there is a change, a need change, a preference change comes into position, a new attribute is being brought into position for evaluation criteria, then the marketer needs to build that framework or build that product in a system where he can then place it in a point which will be again perceived as better than or unique and differentiated with value against the competitor's products. And remember, we have always been mentioning and deciding that it is the concept of value that is created through these differentiating points, which is the job of the marketer. Now, therefore, sometimes repositioning is required, particularly when we find that a new need has arisen, a new preference has taken place. However, there could also be the reason that a competitor has positioned himself very close to your product. Now, a good example is, which I will give you, and that position is when you look at a map, you find, let's take an example. I'll give you an example of, let's say you have a magazine, and your magazine, being a tangible product, has got two attributes that we are looking at. One attribute is the amount of written material as against amount of image or pictures. So we can have two attributes. Some people like to look at magazines which have got more pictures. Some other people would like to look at or read more articles. On the other side, we could have the focus of the magazine. There could be, let's say, two types of focus. One is club-oriented. That means people like to talk about get-togethers, social frameworks, so on and so forth. On the other side of the picture, we could have fashion. Now, if we locate, let's take an example. We have, in the beginning, we were more located at, let's say, club orientation or social gathering orientation, and we were also more into pictorials. Now, consider that maybe two other magazines approach the same product or the same targeted area, but one is giving more copy content, that means more written material about clubs and their activities, and another has gone more into pictorial, but again focusing in the club section. Now, these two distinct groups, that is, one person is giving club information with more pictures, the other is giving club information with more activity-based written material. Now, we need to shift. Now, how do we shift? It is possible that we know that there is a segment which is more interested in fashion. Therefore, now what we can do is that we position our editorials towards fashion area. Now, if we do that, and if you look at the chart, and you will see the line where you started from, and you have shifted towards the fashion area to be able to distinguish yourself as still a magazine for a particular segment, but more fashion content. And you can again decide to take the fashion content towards more written material framework or more pictorial framework. Now, having said this to you about the perception or repositioning, let me give another example which will consolidate the whole frame of how positioning and perceptual maps are used to position a product. Particularly, this time I'm going to give you a service example, because we had said that service is a little more difficult, but because of the factor that tangibility is missing. Now, consumers normally buy the product before or the service before they are actually provided the service. A good example is universities and colleges. And keeping this in mind, let's look at an example of a university. Now, the first thing the marketers of the university is required to do is to see what are the important features that people look for in a university. Broadly, if we can look at it from these two angles, students like quality, and they also have a reason of price. So there is a combination there. Quality and price is a combination that seems to be relevant for the students. But the problem is, how do you project this quality? Now, let's look at it. Let's look at the perceptual map of the existing schools that we have. Let's take an example on it. There is a school which is giving low price and perceived quality is also low. And we are now producing a map whereby the consumers are reporting their perception about the school, and the perception is it's low quality and low price. And on the other side, if we look at it on the perceptual map, we see the school B. The first one we can call A, and the second one we call B, and we see that B has got a perception of high quality and has high prices. And let's look at the third one, that is the C. C is, it is low price and it has got a little better quality, and obviously the better quality is in relation to A. It is on the right side of the graph, and it gives you a little bit more quality. But we also see that there is a major gap which is available in the area of price and quality perception between B and this C. So let's take an example that we want to suggest to the market that our school, which we can call CC, is better placed in terms of quality than what we said was C. So we need to produce that. Obviously, price can be easily ascertained. We can have the same level price as given by this C, but we are trying to now say that the quality is of a higher standard. By doing this, but now the question, therefore, what I'm saying is how do you produce this quality? Because the student is going to register or get admission before he can even experience the classroom. What do you do then? You need to produce certain cues, certain clues, certain frameworks which will help the perception of the student to come to the standard of suggesting that this school has to be good and therefore justifiably has better prices. Now, how do we do it? You can see it in your experience. You can see that brochures are produced. Now, brochure is a tangible clue, and I'm saying clue as in C-L-U-E, which means an indicator of the quality. Brochure देखते हैं, brochure की quality को देखा जाता है. Second, associations होती हैं. What we do is we try and suggest that if you have more PhDs, then that university or school perceptually would be better. So you show a list of your faculty, and in that list you try and identify that most of your faculty comes from foreign qualified institutions or have PhDs. Now these aspects become clues towards quality, even though quality is not being suggested and nobody has even gone to the classrooms. Third, sometimes schools do that. They have open houses. In those open houses, what they do is that they invite the parents and the students to go around and see the school itself. So the infrastructure, which is tangible, is again providing an indication of the quality of education. But please remember that school is not supposed to be just buildings and structures and all that. The outcome of the school is quality of education imparted, and obviously that is linked with all the things that are required in the market. But since that classroom behavior, classroom teaching will come subsequently, at this point of time, the school is trying to develop tangible aspects to suggest quality. Now, as we were saying, that there were therefore two reasons of repositioning. One, we said, was locating a group of people who are not satisfied or new preferences coming up. You might like to shift your position and give it a new status. A very good example you will find is Ann Hammer product, which was supposed to be baking powder. Now, baking powder is normally used for the baking purposes, but over a period of time, if you see the ad of Ann Hammer, you will find that they are using or reposition the product in terms of cleanliness, they use it for scrubbing, they use it for deodorizing the refrigerators, and so on and so forth. So they have been able to reposition their product in a number of categorical areas. So the same product, same brand is now being repositioned for more than just baking components. In the same way, positioning can be done in a number of areas. For example, good example is Colgate, which has got anti-tartar, whitening, anti-smoking, and so many toothpaste, and they try and cover and occupy each and every segment area that most probably would be relevant to their product. Now, before we move into the next part of our lecture, let me just touch upon a certain aspect that we had discussed a few lectures back, and that is the concept of risk. Now, if you recall, we had done this concept of risk when we were talking about motivation, because motivation is one factor where risk is very strongly applicable. The idea at that point of time was that certain behaviors are the outcome of risk. And we were suggesting, because this seems to be more relevant in perceptual area, so we would like to recapture all those concepts a little bit more and understand how risk perceptions affect behavior. Not only that, we will also try and see what can a marketer do typically to reduce this perception of risk. Now, the factors that we had discussed at that point of time were that there are certain kinds of risks that are there, like functional risk, like psychological risk, financial risk. There was this physical risk, we had sociological risk, and time risk. Now, we quickly go over each one of them and see how this effect takes place. Now, functional risk can be whether the product will fail to perform. And at that point of time, if you recall, I had said to you that we have a laptop and we were discussing, let's say, the battery life. If somebody had talked to us about 3 hours battery life, then functional failure, risk of functional failure would be that I'm worried because I want to go for a presentation where my battery requirement would be for an hour, and I start having this feeling कि कहीं ये battery fail तो नहीं हो जाएगी. Now this is purely functional risk. Then there is physical risk. Now physical risk is basically some damage may take place. And again, if you recall, we have been listening to these points, particularly in the area of the mobile phones, कि जो लोग mobile phone use करते हैं, their ears might be affected because of the radiation. Now, this physical risk may have no truth, but there is this perception that it can happen and some people have a problem about it. Third could be like the financial risk. Now, the financial risk is, for example, if I'm going to the market to buy a brand and there is a model, let's say this is September, and I have to pay money for this September model, so I could have this perception कि हो सकता है जनवरी में एक नया मॉडल आ जाए, so I would be missing out on that new model. So maybe the risk is financial in terms of how much I pay and then a new model comes into position. I have an issue with that. The fourth risk that we were talking about is social risk, where we can have that, would I be embarrassed if I went into the market or went into the party wearing this particular suit or this particular tie? Would it have an impact which will make me a laughing stock? Somebody would make a kind of a comment on me. Would it spoil my social standing in the people? Similarly, we have the psychological risk factors, which is internally related, and then the time risk factor, which is obviously very simple to understand, that I have wasted my time in trying to buy a product. If it becomes non-functional, then I will have to spend more time to get hold of this kind of a product again. Now, before we move into the final conceptualization that we will have today, let's look at how customers try and reduce this concept of risk. How do they reduce or work towards lowering the risk factors? And from there, we can learn as marketers how to help them to reduce this risk. Now, the first thing that they do, normally, customers do, is that they try and gain more information. The reason for getting more information is very logical. That, for example, somebody wants to go for a trip of bicycling, in the mountains. So what would he do? He is scared now whether he will fail, this trip will fail, the bicycle which he was going to take may not be suitable for that particular area. So what would he do? He will try and get as much information as possible about the train, about the जिस जमीन पे उसने साइकिलिंग करनी है उसके मुतालिक इंफॉर्मेशन, माउंटेन है इट्स डिफरेंट, रोड्स हैं इट्स डिफरेंट, डेजर्ट है इट्स डिफरेंट. Then further he will try and gain more information as to the type of bicycles are available, where he can learn how to improve. I mean, for example, if there is a problem that takes place in the bicycle, how can he correct that problem, and so forth. Now, all these things he does by using the concept of getting more and more information. Now, the second method that he can have is that he would be able to go for brand images. Now, brand image is a very important concept, and we have talked about it because if you have a brand whose image is good, then even if I am risk averse, I would tend to buy a product whose brand is recognized and has a good image. This will cover 2 or 3 factors. Sociologically, or social risk factor is also covered because it's a good brand. Functional area, it's again considered to be because it's a good brand, it's a good brand image, we can be assured that quality would be there. Then we also have brand loyalty. Now, those people who are very risk averse tend to become brand loyal to one brand and continuously buy that because they are sure that whatever that brand produces is going to be up to the standard and they don't have to worry about anything else. Similarly is the concept that normally people who are again risk averse and who are not sure whether the functional capability would be available, physical damage is not going to be there, financial risk is reduced, time spent is reduced, we normally tend to locate retail stores, which makes us confident that when we go to this retail shop, everything would be to our desire. And even if there is a problem that can occur, the retail shop will be responding to us in terms of taking it back, giving a new, the product, even to the extent of delivering the product to the home, which normally a number of retail outlets have started doing. And you will see this more in case of restaurants where you have home delivery services. Now, even big retail outlets have started home delivery service to reduce this time framework or risk factors. Now, having discussed all the concepts regarding the perceptions, including related to the service marketing, quality perceptions, and price and quality relationship, as well as the risk factors involved, we would like to move on to the next topic, and that is a very, very critical topic. The basic reason is, like we said, why do people become more risk averse? What makes them start thinking about or perceiving that this product may have functional malfunctioning, would be financially risky, so and so forth? The problem is that all of these factors come out of our learning process. We've already talked to you in this program where we have been suggesting that most of the perceptions and motivations and behaviors relate to our past experiences and the way we have been able to handle this experience or handle this information. And if you go back to the model that we showed you, where there is a black box where everything takes place based on the stimulus that is provided, which results in the outcome. Now, to be able to really take this whole thing into its proper perspective, a marketer must know how does a consumer learn. Now, the learning process that I was talking about is critical because unless and until a marketer can understand that how does learning take place, we should obviously recognize that there are 2 methods of learning, which is one is deliberate, that you try and learn. The other is called incidental, which means it's accidental. Things happen, experience takes place, some message goes through, some factors occur, and within that, we have learned a process. Now, therefore, we need to be, as marketers, be very clear as to the learning concept. Further on that, we know that there are certain learning theories. and we will try and talk about at least one significant theory in this period, and that is called conditional learning. Now, we will be discussing that and how does it occur. For the important point that we need to recognize is that learning is a process by which marketers or the consumers tend to learn how to purchase, how to consume, and then how to dispose of the product. And if you recall, if you understand this, most of the time we just stop at the concept of consumption. We forget about post-consumption behavior, how to dispose of a product, which could be like the bag. You most probably are quite aware of it. We buy all these plastic bags, but none of us has actually learned how to dispose of that bag. People who have not learned this process normally would throw it on the roadsides and have an environmental hazard taking place, clogging the waterways, clogging the the sewerages, and creating more problem. Therefore, marketers also need to not only look at how consumers consume or buy the product, but also how they dispose of the product, because they have to educate the consumers in various ways. And that is why we tend to study the learning theories. Now, as I told you, that there are basically two distinct theories, and these theories are more like behavioral or cognitive. Now, again, to distinguish between the two, we need to understand where behavioral theories are more concerned with the outcome of a particular behavior in shape of whatever happens, they look at how did the person behave. The cognitive side of the picture, the other theory is how did the person think towards the behavior. So according to cognitive theories, they tend to understand what happens in the mind as a process before the outcome that takes place in the shape of behavior, whereas the behavioral theory, which is conditional framework, suggests that we are only interested in trying to see how did this behavior occur and what was the behavior actually. So let's look at the definition of learning. Now, learning is a process by which individuals acquire the purchase and consumption knowledge and experience that they apply to future related behavior. Now, concentrate on these points. What we are looking at is how this knowledge is created, what experience is generated, and obviously it is all linked with the future. Obviously something has happened in the past, is obviously some relationship is there, but the marketer is more concerned with कि जो उसके पिछले एक्सपीरियंस थे या जो नॉलेज उसने एक्वायर की उसका इम्पैक्ट उसके फ्यूचर बिहेवियर पे क्या आएगा. Given these 2 points, again watch the definition and look at that there are 2 points that are being made. One is it is a process. Therefore, we have to acknowledge that the process can change. The process जब चलता है तो उसका जो end है, the end can change. The behavior that is the end will change. Now, the process includes, like we talked about, the positioning that the marketer is providing, the communication that he is giving, the ultimate experience that the customer has of the product, which was very significant in terms of services marketing, because जब services marketing में एक transaction हो जाती है, तो the person has now got further knowledge and experience जिसकी बिना पर वो next time उस marketer के पास जाएगा या नहीं जाएगा. Would he buy the same product or not? How would he evaluate the image or the brand of that product? So and so forth. So we are more concerned as marketers on the process that takes place, which includes all these factors: the communication, the knowledge that is given out of those communication and the expectations that are created, then the personal experience of the customer in relation to the product. And all these things put together will then project what the customer will do in the future. Now, the second aspect, if you look at it again on the board, you will see that the second expectation or the second part of it is it's related to the future framework. Once the logic is established, we now need to know what are the basic elements that affect learning. Therefore, the knowledge frame is provided by these 3 or 4 elements, and the elements are, let's say, motivation. The second element is the cues. The third is response. The fourth is reinforcement. Now, as we are interested in all these factors, because these are the ones which actually impact our learning process or knowledge creation in the person, we need to understand each one in its own context. If you recall, we have done a lot of discussion on motivational theories. The logic at that time, again, I had suggested that motivation is a very important concept in the area of marketing because it tends to set goals which are achieved from the consumption process by the consumers. And since it is our problem as marketers, how consumers can be influenced to buy our product and consume our product, therefore, our knowledge of motivation becomes critical. Now, in the area of knowledge enhancement or learning process to go up, we need to recognize that the motivation is the moderator between the amount of knowledge that can be generated. And a simple example I'd already given you about a people or a couple or a person who's trying to go for an adventure bicycling tour. Now, I told you that his motivation is to go on an adventure on a bicycle. So normally, therefore, his motivation to learn about bicycling, about the environment, about where is he going to go, how much adventure can he achieve, what kind of price would be available for the bicycle, as well as for the tour, he needs to be strongly motivated. Now, that will determine how much learning will take place. Similarly, people who are interested in, let's say, buying a video game, their interest or motivation is to play and enjoy the video game. Therefore, to be able to achieve that high level among a number of products that are available, the logic would be that he will seek this information and will try and learn as much as he can regarding that particular aspect. Now, that is why we had discussed and we had focused on a number of theories, and all this links up to this point that motivation increases or decreases, the level of motivation increases or decreases the level of desire to learn. Now, the second aspect is cues. Now, cues are basically stimulus or clues that are given to put direction to the motivation. Now, naturally, taking the same example of the person who is going for an adventure on bicycling tour would obviously require to know where can you find the most robust mountain bike. Now, because he has started concentrating on the factor that he will be going for a tour, a bicycling tour on the hills, so he needs to now find out where can he find the most suitable mountain bike. Now, for that, he has to find cues. Where would he get them? Maybe in a journal, maybe in a magazine, and these magazines and these aspects will try and put him into the areas which he wants to learn about, which he thinks is important. So he will talk to his friends, he will talk to various other products, compare them, learn about those products, and then try and figure out how much or which particular product he would be able to buy. Now, the third is response and reinforcement. Now, this is another concept which is related to the learning process, and the theory suggests or the research suggests that the number of times you reinforce a particular behavior, the person will become habituated into it. Now, to be able to understand this reinforcement concept and the response concept that is there is, I will take this example from the human resource management science, because that is the typical example which can then be applied to a number of marketing contexts. For example, a salesperson is required, and he is required to go to his clients, let's say 5 times a week. Now, this is the object of his behavior, and this is the response that the company wants out of him. Now, if he does that and he is given a bonus for every 5th visit that he has done to his customers, and he is awarded on that, then obviously he will try and repeat the same behavior again and again. Now, therefore, the two things are coming into position. The response requirement is you want a particular behavior from him. And if we compare that with the marketing context, we will say that you want your product to be purchased by this person. Now, reinforcement is that every time this person, the salesperson, had visited the customers 5 times, he was given a bonus. Now, this is reinforcement. Take this example in terms of marketing. What we are saying is that the person has behaved in a particular manner. He's bought your product. Now, he wants reinforcement in terms of satisfaction. So, if he is satisfied, he will come back to buy the product. Now, how do you improve these satisfactory levels? We have already discussed this in terms of services marketing, where we discussed the expectation the person has and the ultimate perceptions he has. Now, if the perceptions exceed his expectations, the reinforcement is going to be very strong. And the number of times this reinforcement takes place, the more learning about that product will have taken place. This can now be used in terms of all the other frameworks in terms of marketing, which may include communication. Now, if you repeatedly show, and we had discussed this in terms of when we talked about advertising and communication clutter, and we said that people tend to have this attitude of eliminating certain messages out of their system because they are overburdened. So you try and make sure that the message can go through. And here is where we come into position, this concept of reinforcement. And reinforcement can take place when you create something unique. Now, every time a unique thing comes into position, the response would be that the person will read that material or look at that material in a longer period, and from there, his learning process is taking place, his knowledge is being established, and all these examples that I'm given can be used in many other frameworks. Let's take an example, brand image. A person goes and buys a branded product. He goes to the social gathering, a number of people praise his product or his brand. He is reinforced in this. Next time, if he ever has to buy, he will go and buy the same brand. Same is the case with brand loyalty. Now, if I go to the market, I find a product which fits with my desires or my needs, logic is that I will not even try and look at any other product because this one has satisfied me. I'll pick it up. This will become my brand, and I have become brand loyal to it. And it is the same logic which takes us into the concept of brand equity. Now, having talked about these frameworks where we can discuss the brand equity, let's now consolidate this discussion. Again, we should be able to see that in motivation, the relationship is between the outcome that we are expecting and its very strong relevance or need focus. On the other side, the cues which we are going to be sending out to the customer has a very strong relationship between the direction of the motivation and its relevance to our own conceptualizations or our own psychological frameworks. We had discussed, if you recall, in the beginning, when we said that what is more relevant in terms of our cultural frames is more relevant to our learning processes. So we try and avoid all those cues which do not fit in with our own relevance framework. And like we are discussing now as a learning process, we suggested, and I told you about the person who is going for a tour, cycling tour, adventure tour. His relevance to the information will be that he will only seek information regarding cycles or bicycles which are mountain related, or what we call mountain bikes. So there is a direct relationship between the cues that we have and the relevance of the cue to the fact of our motivation. The third thing that we talked about was response, and obviously response outcome is purchase behavior. And the final relationship that we want to have is between the association between expectation and experience. If expectation and experience are close to each other, we have satisfaction and we become grounded in the knowledge that whatever we bought was significantly what will be bought again. So future direction is determined between the logic of or association between expectations and the outcome that we have, and response outcome that we have. So we looked at all of these three factors or four factors. Now, the point that is left is, and we need to talk about it, is how does this knowledge get created, or how does this learning process take place? Please don't forget that learning is both information, how we organize this information, how we respond to this information, plus experience. So when we have experience, knowledge is grounded. Now, knowledge can be acquired in a number of ways. One is that we are deliberately seeking knowledge, like in the example of the mountain biker who wants to go for an adventure. But we can also learn incidentally or accidentally. Let's say a car is in an accident, and a person is passing, he sees that one of the cars is more damaged. Automatically, without his really seeking this information, he sees that this head-on collision took place. He does not have any other information, but he sees one of the cars more damaged. If he sees the brand, it will sit in his mind that this brand is weaker in terms of if there was an accident. Now, this learning has been created without his really seeking this process or this knowledge. But there is no question that we can say that this knowledge is right or wrong, or accurate or not accurate. We have already suggested that reality might be totally different, but the perception of the reality is what becomes important. Now we will move on to the theories that we have. And I had in the beginning, when we started this lecture, I told you that there are major two classes of theories. One is known as the behavioral theories, and the other is the cognitive theories. Now, in that also at the beginning, I had discussed that behavioral theories normally look at the outcome of all the process of learning. That is, in terms of how would a person behave at an end product. But the cognitive theories, which we will take subsequently in the next class, we will look at the process of thinking. Cognitive is basically thinking. How does this thinking impact the behavioral process and the outcome of the behavior? Now, if we look at one of the most classical theories is what we call the conditional classical theory. And this relates to Pavlov. Mr. Pavlov was a researcher, and he had been looking at why people behave in a particular manner, and he was trying to link up the outcome of behavior through conditional learning processes. Now, in this case, he was experimenting with dogs. Now, what he was doing was he would ring a bell, and after the bell was rung, he would put a meat paste, gosht ka masala bana ke, he would put it on the tongues of the dogs. जो ही जबान पे dogs के वो मसाला लगता था, तो they used to start salivinating, which is थूक निकलना शुरू हो जाता था. So he started doing this experiment, and every time he would ring the bell, he would put the paste, the meat paste, on the tongues of the dogs, and the dogs would salivate. Now, by doing this repeatedly, and this is what we talked about in terms of reinforcement, and this reinforcement is taking place. Try and understand this reinforcement concept is now moving in, which was the elements of learning, कि वहाँ response था भूख लगना, and that hunger was being depicted by the salivation that was taking place. Reinforcement क्या है? कि reinforcement थी when repeatedly the dogs were getting the meat paste. उनको वो taste मिल रहा था. So constantly doing that, he stopped giving the paste to the dogs, and he only rung the bell. घंटी बजते ही the dogs would start salivinating. तो हुआ क्या कि जो कंडीशनल क्यू था या कंडीशनल स्टिमुलस था वो है बेल, और अनकंडीशनल और जो कंडीशनल रिस्पॉन्स बन गया उसके बाद वो था उनका सेल्विनेट करना. नाउ द बेल वाज unconditional stimulus. Like I was telling you that there is a link between stimulus and response. So the cue was the bell. अब बेल जो है वो अनकंडीशनल थी, जबकि जो मीट है, जो पेस्ट थी, दैट इज कंडीशनल. और ये दोनों जो है अनकंडीशनल रिस्पॉन्स दे रहे थे, दैट इज सेल्विनेशन. तो ये एक उसका फ्रेम है. यू कैन सी इट ऑन द बोर्ड, वेयर यू कैन सी ऑन द टॉप सेक्शन दैट वी हैव bell as the unconditional stimulus and the conditional stimulus is the meat, and the outcome of the two is unconditional response, that is salvination. And the lower part of the screen you can see that bell becomes the conditional stimulus and salvination becomes the conditional response. Now you try and understand, this may be a little complicated because we are talking about conditional and unconditional. Now what we are saying is कि जिस चीज की वजह से वो खुद ब खुद रिस्पॉन्ड कर रहा था वो अनकंडीशनल है, ठीक है. उसका जो क्यू है या स्टिमुलस है वो अनकंडीशनल है और उसके ऊपर कोई हमने फोकस नहीं किया हुआ, वो खुद ब खुद हो रहा है. सो दैट मीन्स मीट बिकम्स द अनकंडीशनल स्टिमुलस एंड द अनकंडीशनल रिस्पॉन्स, ऑटोमेटिक रिस्पॉन्स जो है उसका, वो है सेल्विनेशन. अब इसमें हमने इंट्रोड्यूस कर दिया बेल. Now bell becomes the conditional stimulus. So over a period of time, we keep using the conditional stimulus along with the unconditional stimulus and then slowly remove the unconditional stimulus. And what is left is now the conditional stimulus and conditional response. That is how this whole thing takes place. Now, if we want to convert this logic of the Pavlovian theory, conditional theory, to a marketing situation, then we can see it again. And I'm presenting this again on the board. And you can see that in this situation, we have converted it into the marketing area. The idea is, let's say that there is a conditional framework is that whenever we have, let's say, some masala jat, which has very nice smell, and there is a dinner time, and this masala smell comes very strong, and obviously the masala is becoming an important concept. So we need to understand that there is a link between good smell of food with hunger. Ab usi time ke upar, if we are also watching television news, and let's say it's 9 o'clock, and whenever the television news is there, kamre mein, the smell of good food starts coming in. Good smell comes in, and we start feeling hungry. Now, again, the two concepts are there. Remember, one is unconditional, and this unconditional is the smell of cooking, and the unconditional responsive, salvination or hunger. Along with this, now we have news, 9 o'clock news. Now, 9 o'clock news is the conditional stimulus. Now, if this is going on for some time, what will happen is, even if there is no cooking taking place, no smell coming out, because let's say the servant has not come today and there is no cooking going to take place at the home, but right at the time when 9 o'clock news start, we start feeling hungry. Now, if people can understand that this logic of hunger is associated with 9 o'clock news, then at that point of time, if a marketer puts in his own ad for, let's say, a pizza or for burger or whatever, or a restaurant, the people will be more inclined to go for that particular aspect. Now, this basically, this model of conditional learning is where the learning is taking place because somebody has been using certain kind of associations, and these associations are between the conditional stimulus and the unconditional stimulus, repeatedly repeated again and again, towards an unconditional response, which was initially unconditional, but over a period of time, it tends to become conditional. So we have this logic, and marketers can apply this logic in a variety of ways. And if you recall again, we were talking about in the period at the beginning, needs and motivation and cues, then sometimes smell is very significant in developing response systems. And again, the desire for purchasing can be impacted through all these frameworks. So today I will be stopping at the Pavlovian conditional theory, which is obviously part of the learning process. And we will take up the cognitive side in the subsequent lecture. But now to recapitulate what we have discussed in this class, we have in the initial stages concluded the area of perception, particularly when we were also discussing how positioning takes place through the logic of perceptual mapping and positioning mapping. Once we had finished that, we then moved on towards the area of repositioning concept, because that is very critical, because normally people or marketers tend to position their product once and then they forget about it. But what is required is that repeatedly perceptions of the market need to be checked again and again, because it is possible that so many things have happened. Competitors have moved in, new response systems are available, new reference points become available, a new niche might come about, and all these require that we reposition our product, because if we do not want to produce a new product for this new position, we might as well use the old product in a new positioning setting. And then we suggested that all these perceptions are the outcome of the learning process. And in the learning process, we categorically stated that there are two types of learning. One is when you are deliberately finding knowledge. The other is incidental. Sometimes knowledge might occur. And to be able to understand this, we need to be able to know about the theories. And there are major groups of two theories. One is the behavioral, for which we have discussed the Pavlovian conditional concept. Plus, we were discussing that we will be undertaking the rest of the theories, which are basically cognitive, so that we have a complete picture of how perceptions occur through the learning mode. And obviously, we cannot ignore the four elements that we have discussed in quite detail. The motivation factor, which has got very strongly grounded theories behind it, the cues, the response system, and the reinforcement. Because unless and until we understand all the three groupings together, we will not be able to really understand the application of these theories. So this brings us to the end of the lecture. The next lecture, we will start with the remaining theories, and we will continue with more examples, and that will be the way we will proceed. Thank you very much. Allah Hafiz.